Hi everyone, welcome back to the Business at Heart podcast. Got a really good episode for you guys this week. In this week, we've got a good friend of mine, Anna Adams. We're talking about censorship and cancel culture. We talk about a few tasty things. Have a listen and then let me know. Let me know what you think. So, bit of a different pod this week. It's not more. I mean, it is. We will sort of relate how these things go to business. But we've got Anna on the pod today. Now, I think I don't even know how long I've known Anna. Anna is one of the most entertaining people on social media, I would say, especially Twitter. One of the main, really, really big reasons I follow her is for her opinions on a couple of things. Now, the reason I wanted Anna on today is because today we're going to be talking about censorship and then also cancel culture because the main reason is because I've seen her tweeting about this over the last year or so I really wanted her over. So Anna, before we get started, tell everyone a bit about yourself and why I specifically wanted you on this for this pod.
So I'm 24. I'm a feminist. I first found myself thinking about freedom of speech and cancel culture when I was writing my dissertation at uni, which was about the term TERF, which was originally coined as an acronym for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. So I wanted to explore where that word had come about and why and how it was being used. I argued that it has since been weaponized and is often used as a derogatory slur intended to silence women who challenge gender ideology. And obviously, this topic's become a lot more public since J.K. Rowling weighed in on the debate. And I think, a lot of people now have some level of understanding to a greater or lesser degree about the debate that is happening in the UK around freedom of speech and how it relates to that specific issue.
Okay, so first on, what do you think? So to you, what is censorship? Like, what does that mean?
Um, well, I guess censorship to me is the limitation of, or the limiting of a view that's being expressed. I When I think of censorship now, I think of Twitter. I first became aware of the issue really when the founder of Feminist Current, Megan Murphy, who's a Canadian journalist, was permanently banned from Twitter in November 2018 after referring to a self-identified trans woman, Jessica Yaniv, as him. So she used the wrong pronoun. But most recently, we've obviously seen Donald Trump,
Yeah.
arguably one of the most powerful men in the world, become permanently banned from Twitter, which I think is kind of, well, it's very complex, but it's certainly concerning, as it suggests that our understanding of institutional power is becoming increasingly complex. So I think right now, censorship is becoming more prevalent on social media. And that's largely where a lot of us get our understanding from it at the moment, because that's where we see it happening.
Yeah, see, so where I first wanted to start is censorship on like online platforms, which you touched on there, and I think that the big one now is obviously Donald Trump
Mm.
it got ended. There'd been like a few, there'd been like obviously in England there'd been like Katie Hopkins, Tommy Robinson, them types of people. Now, what I sort of wanted to get, what the first part I wanted to start at is, in terms of that, how it impacts, because what I think personally is, I think social media platforms, mainly Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, are going sort of down a bit of a dangerous territory. And let me say first off, I don't support Donald Trump. I don't support Tommy Robinson or Kate Hopkins. Let me just get that out there. So this isn't specifically about them. It's more about how, is it censorship? Do you think in that sense, do you think it's censorship? Like those get, because usually what you see now is when someone gets banned, they sort of put a label as it's hate policy or
Mm.
spread. Do you think that is censorship?
Well, I guess the key debate surrounds questions of, on the one hand, um, banning people and the view that it undermines the idea of an open internet. And on the other hand, what might be seen as a failure to sufficiently monitor incitements of violence, which, that's kind of what you're saying there. Those are the sort of arguments that we're dealing with. I personally have concerns about permanently banning public figures online. I think when high profile personalities are permanently banned, I worry that it might push debate further underground, where it might have the potential to become increasingly extreme or toxic or radical, which can then, I think also with the likes of Donald Trump, one of the worries is that it kind of plays into this victim complex. So his supporters see his ban as a greater reason to support him because they
Yeah.
feel that they're being censored. I think it's quite an authoritarian perspective, not to just monitor, but actively censor language and speech. And I do worry that where's the line? Where do we draw the line as to what's acceptable and what's not acceptable?
That's it. I think, first off, I think what you said there is right. It's stopping discourse a bit. Because I think it's because obviously it's a really sort of touchy time, especially in America, but it stops actual discourse. And I think it kind of makes him, like you were saying, to his supporter and his base, it makes him kind of a martyr because then the more, his supporters are more emboldened because of that. And then where I worry is who decides the standard? Because why now? Because Trump and other people, they've said things in the past before that have had, certain consequences. Why now? Is it because he's just about to leave office, or would they have done this 2-3 years ago? That's my main concern, is why now?
Yeah, I think it's become a much more topical issue. I think a lot of it ties into the way that brands like to market themselves. And I think that I assume we'll talk about this a bit later on, but with cancel culture, there's a lot of pressure on brand partners or associates to kind of publicly condemn people that have said arguably offensive things and sometimes objectively offensive things. So I think that that's happening more because of outside pressures. I think also just because social media has seen so much growth, it's where a lot of public discourse happens now. It's all on Twitter. It's not just, a long time ago, comments that perhaps Donald Trump makes on Twitter, you would only have access to read those if he'd been interviewed by a newspaper or on the television. Whereas now everybody has the freedom to put their thoughts out there all the time. So I think that kind of has encouraged a wider backlash to tweets in particular.
Yeah. The concern for me, like getting into like the free, because people have been saying just deleting someone off a social media platform is an attack on free speech. I see the argument, but I also see the other side, because I saw Jack, the guy who owns Twitter, and he was saying, well, Twitter is they're a private entity. You don't have to be on Twitter. So when you go on there, and I actually went and resaw this, but when you go on there, you have to sign a waiver that you have to adhere by Twitter's rules, because they're a private they're a private platform, and so technically they're saying it's not an attack on freedom of speech because he's breaking their criteria, for that. So that's the main thing. But what I think they're doing is, I think they're opening themselves up. They're opening Pandora's box. Because do you remember a couple of years ago? Like, this is, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. Obviously, everyone knows who R. Kelly is. When it first, do you remember when the doc that basically exposed all of his, we're not going to get into that, but that basically exposed everything. And I think it was Spotify, Apple Music, but I think it was Spotify. Spotify took his music off and said, we don't want to condone that. And then what that then opened up is, well, if you're going to take him off, then you'd have to take off half the music entertainers in the world, because, I mean, I don't mean to disparage people, but if you look at all the quote unquote, all the quote unquote rappers, they've they've got loads of stuff around around them. So where do you stop? Why is it that person? Now they took his music back on, but I think that's the direction that Twitter will go into, because like obviously for people in England, like they started banning Tommy Robinson first, Katie Hopkins, and then who's going to be next is my point, because what I'm trying to say is what's the criteria?
Yeah. I think as well, I mean, the thing with Twitter is arguably, although it's a private company, considering how widely it's used now as a news source, there could be an argument somewhere made by somebody more articulate than me to suggest that, Twitter could become more of a public good, in which case then their guidelines might not really stand up to much. I kind of think the thing is there's a everybody has the freedom to say whatever they want to say, right? Within that, you also have the freedom to respond or the freedom to walk away, which is, lawful. And it should be like that. But there's a big difference between walking away from something and having your platform removed from you to say something. So I kind of think that this is where the issue with Twitter is that actually you're not giving people the option to walk away. You're just saying, no, you can't be on this platform anymore. And as you've pointed out, then the boundaries become very blurred. And even though right now the argument is, okay, well, the people that are being banned for inciting violence, there have been cases like Meghan Murphy, who was permanently banned for misgendering somebody, which, doesn't seem to be inciting violence. So there's different
It's touchy,
justifications for different people being banned. And if this is where we're at now, then it seems like it's only going to get worse
and worse,
in 10 years, 20 years. And I think then it does become worrying, because really you've got people who work in tech essentially deciding which discourse we can and can't talk about, which is quite scary.
So what do you say to, because I saw I was listening to another pod the other week where they were talking about, well, specifically for Trump, one of the arguments was he was spreading false information. So you got the most famous man in the world for a period of time, and with the oil election, he said he's spreading false information. Where do you stand on that when people who've got big platforms are looked upon to be spreading false information?
I mean, the dissemination of false news has been so problematic in the last few years. I really do think that a lot of platforms online have really struggled to react to it and struggled to monitor it and kind of reduce the harm of it. I kind of think that one way of looking at it is a bit more holistically. And, I know that in schools now there's a bit more education towards computer literacy, internet literacy. And I think it's a good thing to be able to try and teach people to evaluate news sources, to find out what's credible and what's not themselves. However, I do think that Twitter banning people is somewhat reactionary to the problem of false news. I think it's kind of easier for them to ban people or remove controversial profiles than to really clamp down on the false news stuff. It seems like there's two issues and they're kind of reacting to both with one solution, which doesn't really seem to work at the moment.
I'll tell you what I like. Like when it first happened with the election, I think, or the election of COVID, when someone put something about the election, there'd come like a little Dropbox. It would say like, I remember when Trump started saying it, they'd put like a little Dropbox like, oh, information hasn't been substantiated. I like that, because you're still leaving him on, but you're letting people know, oh, okay, this might not be 100% kosher. Like I'd say that would be better than just getting rid of him, Because at least then you're letting people know this information isn't substantiated.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that Twitter have tried recently which are kind of on the right track. I think one thing they also, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was to do with like political advertising on the platform, which they tried to limit, which was good. And recently they've added a function where when you retweet a news article, it will ask you, have you read, if you haven't clicked on the article and you retweet it, it will say, have you read this article?
Really?
Um, which I think is also quite good. But then obviously a lot of people will just click no. But I think in the same way that, you know, if you get an email and it's from a bit of a dodgy source and like you might click the link and they'll say, oh, this isn't a certified web address, be careful. In the same way that we do that, I agree that social media platforms could easily compile lists of sites that aren't very credible and just warn people. I think that that is something which probably would be more helpful. Um, yeah, I think that that's a good move forward.
Yeah, I think. I mean, with the sort of spreading of fake information, like I said, there should be something that warns you, like
Mm.
you know, because everyone's gonna read what they read, like everyone's got what you know whatever they read, and they read it as gospel, but there should be something that warns you this isn't substantiated, or this just you know something so that the average reader on Twitter doesn't see. I remember like the other week with COVID, because there was so many with the tests and all that. I remember a member of staff come in and said something. I won't even repeat what she said, but it was something completely ridiculous. And I asked her, "Where'd you get this from?" And she was like, "I saw it on Facebook." And I was
Mm.
just like, you know, and she's quite an intelligent person, but I think there should be something that says, okay, this isn't substantiated. But in terms of censorship, I think for me the main point one of the big reasons I want to talk about that particular point is, I think social media platforms are treading on sort of dangerous territory,
Mm.
because there will come a point. Trump may have been it, but there will come a point where users start to sort of question the banning. I don't necessarily think it's censorship, because again, they are a private company. You don't have to have an Instagram. You don't have to have a Twitter. You can get off and go to another. You know, if Trump wanted, he could go to another site. So I don't know. I'm
He even
conflicted.
got banned by Pinterest though, didn't he? So I don't think he's
Oh,
actually
okay,
very
okay, okay,
very big
okay,
at the moment.
okay. I don't suppose he can go. He can go anywhere there. Also, another thing actually, and this is another thing I want to talk about is, I think sites should do more. You know, when people create like fake accounts and all that,
Mm.
because I saw something recently in the news about this. I think you should have to sign up completely. You shouldn't be able to make a fake account. I think every account you make should be authentic. Because I
Mm.
remember I was watching something in the news and they're talking about Prince Andrew and how he'd paid for people to make fake accounts to go at one of his accusers online and create a movement
Oh
against her.
right, yeah.
So I think that side of it they need to sort of air out, because that's a bit dodgy as well. The next part, this is the proper in-depth part I wanted you on for, because I've seen you talking about it quite a lot. It was the cancel culture topic.
Mm.
And you mentioned it at the start, but it was the main one that I've seen you talking about was J.K. Rowling.
Hmm.
So for everyone that doesn't know, if you've been on the rock, cancel culture is when, well, actually, I don't even know what cancel culture is these days, but it's usually when people have something either dodgy in their past or something people perceive to be dodgy and they try and cancel them for that. Usually it's celebrities, people with a high sort of profile and things like that. And the most recent one that we're just talking about now is J.K. Rowling, who's the writer of the Harry Potter books. Now this is dodgy, but she'd said something with regards to, actually, Anna, you say, because I saw you, I saw you tweeting about it. She'd said something with, I think she'd misgendered someone. If that was, I don't even think
Yeah,
it was that, was
so
it?
basically like I would define or describe cancel culture as a form of social ostracism, kind of like excommunication from the church back in the day, um, which has become increasingly popular as social media has developed. my first memory of kind of being aware of cancel culture is, like you said, kind of a trend where people were digging through social media accounts of celebrities and finding old tweets which were derogatory. There might have been racism, misogyny, or homophobia. And this resulted in public backlash and then pressure on associated partners or brands to distance themselves from the author of those tweets. I found that a bit of a strange trend. I remember, I think it was 2017, there was a YouTuber, Jack Maynard, who went on I'm a Celebrity, and old tweets of his were brought back up, which had included racist and homophobic language. And ITV removed him from the show. Obviously, it's so important to condemn the use of discriminatory language. And as a feminist, I feel really strongly about that. But the one kind of concern I had was that discourse changes so rapidly. And many of us grew up not really knowing what the consequences of posting on social media were. So for me, what would have been better is kind of, people that were getting drawn into that trend, allow those tweets to surface. And if you wrote stuff like that, then it's important for you to apologize and kind of make a commitment to questioning why you had that attitude in the first place and kind of doing better. But I'm not sure that kind of retroactively punishing somebody for a tweet they made when they were 14 or younger or in their teens at all is necessarily helpful. But J.K. Rowling, she basically weighed in on the debate between feminists and trans rights activists, which has been going on in the UK now for about 2 or 3. Well, it's kind of become increasingly volatile in the UK now. Essentially, the crux of the issue is over a conflict of rights between women's rights and trans rights. And J.K. Rowling had kind of been following this discussion on Twitter. This is where most of it takes place, on Twitter, which is kind of where I did my dissertation as well. I used Twitter to recruit participants and kind of analyze a lot of tweets from there. And J.K. Rowling, originally what happened was she wrote a tweet which was criticizing a brand or a company, I can't remember who it was, who were describing women as menstruators rather than women. And J.K. Rowling put a tweet, a bit of a joke, saying something like, oh, if only we had a word for those people. Is it women? And then spelt women in like a number of different ways. It was a bit of a piss take. After that, she got quite a lot of criticism. And then in response, she wrote quite a long essay explaining her position on women's rights and basically her concerns about gender ideology. When that was published, she published that on her own website. She was immediately called transphobic and called a TERF, alongside plenty of other insults. She was dragged through the press. I think it was the Daily Mail who printed an interview with her former partner who was violent towards her, which was a bit dodgy, really. But yeah, so J.K. Rowling has really kind of brought this whole topic of cancel culture much to the forefront of people's minds, because it's probably the most well-known case in the UK at the moment. So essentially, people were trying to cancel her by slurring her and dismissing her views as transphobic. That's kind of how it all started, I guess.
See, back to cancel, I remember the very first time I sort of was aware of cancel culture was, I think it was 2014, 2015. There's a footballer called Andre Gray, and this had been like when he was still at Burnley. He'd been doing really, really well, whatever, and they'd gone back into his tweets like 5 years prior when he was like 16 or 17. He'd said something, I think it was homophobic. He'd said something disparaging about like Whitney Houston and all that. And then they'd used that to ban him and at the time he wasn't even a professional footballer. He was just been a kid in the street. I thought that was I think my problem with cancel culture is it doesn't the you were then may not be the you are now.
Mm.
Is my big problem, because how do you know he still believes that? How do you know how do you know that person still believes that? And I think my problem with cancel culture is it doesn't let people grow, and then also it completely stops discourse.
Mm.
Completely stopped discourse, because I remember I'm a big sports fan, but I remember in the NBA one of the owners got videoed saying something really, really racist, like really, really racist. So the NBA takes the team away from him, bans him. Now, I think they missed the trick there, because what that does is when you publicly wag your finger at that stuff, you don't start, you walk away from the conversation. And what that done is everyone else who's around him who believes the same thing, they go indoors. They don't
Mm.
have to come out. They go completely indoors because they think, oh, we're gonna do that. What should have been done was let him own it, let no one play for him. Then that starts a conversation. If
Mhm.
someone like you were saying, if someone said something 10 years ago, let's see if they really think that way now. Let's see if they've learned from that. Let's see, let's actually let them grow. So that's my main big thing with cancel culture. And then what bothered me about the J.K. Rowling thing, because it started a couple of years ago, because I remember what you're talking about is how it started. I remember the back in the last year, she wrote a book. And in the book, I remember, this is even before the book came out. The problem with cancel culture is it makes people irrational. Because I remember J.K. Rowling had wrote a book, and the book wasn't actually someone who was transgender. It was actually about someone who cross dressed. Now,
Mhm.
before anyone had even read the book, they tried to cancel. I remember there was the hash. I think it was hashtag RIP J.K. Rowling or something like that, and they tried to say that she was being transphobic. Come to find out, when you read the book, it's got nothing to do with anyone
Mhm.
transgender. So I think that's the danger that cancel culture brings, because usually we're canceling people for things that happened way back when, or it makes people be irrational, in terms of in cases like that, which I think is dicey territory.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of points there that are really interesting. So, I mean, firstly, to me anyway, the whole underlying premise of cancel culture is kind of like you said, that it doesn't allow people to grow. So, people that support cancel culture, it feels like they often believe that your attitudes are very rigid. So, you believe this then, and you still believe it now, and you'll believe it in 10 years. Um, and then, as a byproduct of that, all that happens is debate gets shut down. And like you said, uh, shared beliefs end up being contained to the locker room rather than throughout public discourse, um, meaning that people can't discuss and learn from each other. I think even when you fundamentally disagree with somebody, and even when somebody says something which is completely outrageous, you can still learn from them. It's still important to understand why they think that and how they came to that view. So for me, when I think about misogyny, I would much rather somebody say something extremely misogynistic and post it on Twitter, and that be published, and people can have a conversation following on from that about why it's misogynistic, where those attitudes came from, rather than just say, you can't think that. If you say that, your platform will be removed. Because all that does to me is aggravate people further. Like I said earlier, it pushes things underground. Um, and then you're in a situation where you don't actually know what the opposition are thinking. You don't know what their arguments are. You can never learn. You can't find solutions if you can't understand each other's arguments. Um, I think also, like you said about that book that J.K. Rowling wrote, I think actually it came from one sentence, pretty much, and it was completely misconstrued. Um, and the thing is that the stuff that J.K. Rowling wrote that essay about is a really important topic at the moment in the UK. It's a huge, huge source of debate. Um, Feminists, on one hand, have very valid concerns, and trans people have very valid concerns. There is no point in either side trying to block the other side's arguments. All that does is create a situation where there's no helpful conversation, there's no productive conversation, which means that you're never going to get any solutions to the problems that both of you feel that there are. um, I feel very concerned by the willingness to shut down debate, and a lot of it really seems to come from our generation. It's happening on university campuses. I mean, like big feminists like Germaine Greer getting blocked from UK universities. Universities are meant to be the, the ballpark of debate, of public discourse. That's where you're meant to challenge each other's views and learn. And if this is happening in universities, it really doesn't bode well for anywhere else.
So then, what do you think? So, what do you think the effect of cancel culture, well, one on society, but then on just the individuals themselves is?
Well, I mean, in wider society, I think cancel culture and no platforming helps to create echo chambers, which I don't think are particularly helpful, regardless of whatever the issue is. It means that people end up following people that they agree with and kind of automatically othering people that they don't agree with. So thinking, well, I know that they believe this, so I'm not going to learn anything from them. It's not even worth my time to have a conversation with them. Which again, just it means that you're going around in circles all the time, basically. But on a more individualistic level, cancel culture does have really wide ramifications for people. I think it's really important to distinguish between people like J.K. Rowling and Donald Trump, who find themselves in the middle of cancel culture storms. These are wealthy people. These are high profile people. They're going to be fine regardless. They've already got their money. They've got their
Yeah,
followers. They've got their supporters. But the people that we do need to think about are people like you and I, people who might be working class or might be affected by any other form of oppression, who are increasingly being cancelled for various levels of things, which can result in job loss, leading to financial insecurity, can lead to being doxxed online, can lead to threats of, I'm thinking specifically about women here who've talked about the gender debate, but women who have been the victim of threats of physical and sexual violence, not only to themselves but to their families. Their addresses have been published online. They've actually been the victim of physical violence at rallies, at protests, which not only is that incredibly traumatic at the time, but can evolve into things like PTSD as well. But that's the key thing. I think a lot of people, when they're talking about cancel culture, only really want to think about these high profile people, which makes it easier for them to argue that cancel culture is not really as big a problem as people like I might say that it is, because they'll kind of say, well, J.K. Rowling's not really cancelled, but I'm more concerned about people who are losing their jobs, who aren't, wealthy children's authors.
see that's actually one of the last things on my list in terms of cancel culture. Can you actually cancel someone?
Mm, well, I think if we really interrogate what the intention behind cancelling somebody is, it seems to me that it's to remove their platform from them, to encourage public opinion to be dismissive of everything they say based upon potentially one condemnable statement. So for this to be successful, then to truly cancel somebody, you essentially would have to ensure that nobody listens to them, nobody is going to support their views, which is quite a big task. Often I think cancelling somebody has the opposite effect. I think it projects them further into the media, garnering attention to their perceived crime, and potentially galvanising more support for them. So, you know, while efforts definitely can be made to cancel people, I would argue that many public figures who faced attempts at cancellation still remain public figures. You know, Donald Trump supporters haven't gone away overnight. J.K. Rowling's book sales through 2020 increased significantly. I worry more about the non-public figures, non-wealthy figures who face serious ramifications, many of which could be unjust merely for contesting the status quo. So I think, yeah, you can try to cancel somebody. The amount of success that you have is varying, but it feels like there's more success in cancelling people who aren't famous. You know, they're the people that actually do suffer job losses and suffer those, more devastating consequences rather than people who already have a very significant platform.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'll be honest with you. I think cancelling famous people is stupid, and I don't think it ever really, really works. Could list off a bunch of names. I remember people tried to cancel Chris Brown. It's 2020. He's still around. Loads and loads of. I don't think you can actually cancel someone. Kevin Hart for the Oscars, they tried to cancel him because of that. So I don't necessarily believe famous/wealthy people can be cancelled. I think it's more your average person who, like, one of the things you see a lot, like especially last sort of summer, obviously, race was a really prevalent conversation, all over. And what I sort of wasn't comfortable with was when people who aren't of color didn't know something and they'd put throwaway comments there. The reaction was really substantial, and there was a bit of not cancelling, but painting of people in a certain light. And what I feared was that affects the normal person more, because then they won't ask those questions. Then we can't educate them. So I think in terms of that, you're not cancelling any. You're not cancelling. No one's cancelling J.K. Rowling. Like no one's doing that. But me, you on the street, we say something online that is deplorable or is questionable, then there might be some sort of reaction. But I don't think anyone. I think the conversation needs to be split into two: how we deal with your average person, and then how you deal with celebrities.
Well, I think, there's a real difference between cancelling and calling somebody out, which I think that's kind of like for normal people. If you hear your friends say something which you think is really, really questionable, nowadays you would feel quite confident to say to them, actually, I really don't think you should say that, and this is why, and have that conversation, and it can be a tool for education and growth. And that is still possible. You can still do that on Twitter. You don't have to permanently ban somebody to call them out for something. Also, I mean, I kind of think Spotify, I know you said about the R. Kelly stuff earlier. I didn't know that they'd actually removed his music, but I remember earlier this year, they kind of were thrust into the spotlight a bit more when Octavian was alleged by his former partner of domestic violence. And rather than being completely removed by Spotify from the platform, Spotify provided an option for users to block an artist, to completely block them, so that they're never added by the app to like individual playlists, which I thought that was quite a good idea, as it allows Spotify to remain impartial while allowing the users the option to censor. And it kind of, that seemed to me like it was still calling somebody out. It was acknowledging that, his behavior was wrong, and he was dropped by his label. Being dropped by your label, that's again very different to kind of being banned, like being banned from making music or being banned from a platform. his label dropping him, that was kind of a response, that was a reaction, that was saying, actually, you don't kind of align with our principles, we don't want to work with you anymore. But he wasn't banned from making music. If he found another label to take him on, then that's his prerogative. Whereas with Twitter and like the Trump thing, he's just banned. I don't know, it seems like there's a difference there for me.
Wait, isn't that is there? Because isn't that kind of they are kind of cancelling, because your label dropping you is them kind of ending sort of your career a little bit.
Well, yeah, but I guess, ultimately, with things like SoundCloud as well, like if Octavian wants to release music, he can release music. And it's kind of like, I don't know, like I was talking to my brother recently, and I think it's Dutch Avelli, like he was accused of talking to like an underage girl, and the screenshots got aired. And now, things have changed a lot in the music industry, whereas a couple of years ago, I knew people that would still quite happily listen to Chris Brown or XXX Tentacion, like after the allegations about him and his partner came up. Whereas now, when these allegations last year with Octavian and Dutch Avelli came out, I know plenty of people who just sort of said, oh, well, I'm just not going to listen to them. Like, and that's kind of like the self-censorship where people are making that decision for themselves, which if then everybody else says, oh, I don't want to listen to you, that's very different to Spotify saying you can't listen to them,
Yeah. I think that's different, and possibly that's a good way to do it, because I suppose they are putting a label on him, but they're giving you the option of not actually wanting to hear him again. But I think it's dangerous when they themselves take action, because then for him being accused of domestic violence, well, are they going to remove Chris Brown's, every other rap artist who've been dealt with? But that's fair enough. So on the last, so what I wanted for us next was, I put out a little Q&A. We've had some funny ones from a few people that you and I both know.
Oh, great.
So the first one isn't it okay for controversial or harmful people to be removed from social media?
I don't think it's a valid reason to ban somebody for being controversial. I understand the arguments for banning people when it can clearly be proven that they're inciting violence. So, in the case of Donald Trump, that to me does, if that's the reason they're going with, that it was incitement of violence, that is more valid to me. But just for being controversial alone, I don't think that is a reason to ban somebody. Controversy is how we learn. Things only become controversial because they were once seen okay and now they're not, or they're not seen okay, and we have to understand why that is. So I think controversy is a great way to learn. And also, you don't have to follow controversial people. People think I'm controversial. You don't have to follow me.
I can't imagine that. No, I think I might have said it earlier, but I think it's I don't believe in getting rid of the problem if it is a problem. I think one, you don't have to listen to, like I remember when Katie Hopkins and Tony Robinson was on, I didn't follow them. I don't follow people who I dislike. I don't click on their Twitter pages because I know what I'm gonna get. And I think it's a dangerous position where we're just removing people we don't like because we don't like them, because they do have a following for a reason. Because there's a high number of people who you wouldn't think would follow them. So I think that's a bit of a dangerous one. Question number 2. This is more of a statement than a question. It's not an attack on freedom of speech because Twitter, Instagram, and all the social media platforms are private entities. Do you agree? So that's more of a statement than a question.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that. And like Donald Trump is still free to say whatever he wants. It's just unfortunately not on Twitter now. He can't say it on Twitter. But like I said earlier, I think if Twitter is increasingly going to become a news source and kind of more of a public good, then this will become a much bigger issue, and there will be a lot more to consider as to whether it's okay, depending on how Twitter grows in the next 10 years or so.
Like I say, I'm conflicted because I don't agree with deplatforming people, but then I also think you don't have to be on that app. Like, what, why don't people use, Snapchat's not as popular as it used to be. Things like that. Loads of apps that have come and gone. You don't necessarily have to be on that app. This is a tasty one. So, question for Anna: what do you think about people who are unjustly cancelled?
Well, that's why I have so many concerns, because the whole crux of the issue is whose decision is it? Like, what boundaries are we saying, and who gets to decide what's acceptable and what's not acceptable? For me, my hard boundary is, if you're using a public platform to incite violence, then, that is an understandable reason to ban somebody from that platform. When you're banning somebody because you disagree with what they say, that's unjust. I don't think that's right. And I mean, for example, there was a feminist called Maya Forstater, and she lost her job after a series of tweets which were misgendering people online. And she went to court over it. She went to an employment tribunal, and a judge ruled that her view of sex is absolutist and not worthy of respect in a democratic society. Her view is that you can't change sex. Now, I think that is unjust. I think she should be allowed to have that view. She hasn't been banned from Twitter, but she lost her job over that. That to me is unjust. I don't see how that is justified. That's a belief that she can carry. It's not inciting violence against anybody. It's not harming anybody. That's just her belief.
I think that's the main danger with cancel culture, because cancel culture is a broad term, but what if we cancel someone and they didn't do it, or they weren't actually in the wrong? And then also, I think you said it at the very start, the atmosphere of stuff was different 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And I think we're a danger of judging people today by actions that they did before. Because I remember I was talking to my old man. We were talking about Winston Churchill, because in the summer the statues were a big debate, and he was and my dad was basically saying that Winston Churchill did a lot of things that in today's society are looked upon as wrong, but from his time they weren't looked upon that way. So to judge him on that is unjust. But I think that's my main problem with cancel culture, is how is that side of it.
We have to bear in mind the political and the social context in which something was said, and that varies. Things that we said 10 years ago, you wouldn't dream of saying now. It doesn't mean that what you said at the time was right. It doesn't mean that you should have been allowed to say it without consequence, but you did. It doesn't mean we'd say it now. It means that we would look back and think, oh God, that was really bad. I'm glad we don't say that anymore,
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. And then the very, very last question is, should we hold social media and actual general media accountable for disseminating false information, and then what should be the action taken?
Absolutely. I think given the growth of social media, they really need to do more to prevent the dissemination of false news. Because as much as, we can say that Donald Trump incites violence, if Twitter is the platform upon which false news is being spread so prolifically, then they need to be accountable for the fact that it's on their platform that news which is false, which is inciting violence, is being shared. I do think they should do more to clamp down on it. I think they have a responsibility. If they want to retain the rights that they currently have, they need to do more to prevent false news being shared because it's so dangerous.
I think so, but I'm also conflicted because how do you stop Donald Trump from going on Twitter and saying the election was stolen? Because he like that. That's it's a fine line because that
Well, you
because
ban him.
oh yeah, you ban.
Now he can't.
I suppose you ban him. But it's a fine line because if I go and spread a lie on social media, is it the platform's fault or mine? And then are they not censoring me by just shutting that down? That's the murky territory because for me, like I said, why I really liked, especially I'm using Trump because he's the most biggest example. I really like that they put a label to say this is disputed.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think also that does more in terms of showing up Donald Trump than taking him off the platform completely. Taking him off the platform completely kind of feels like putting a toddler on a naughty step and just being like, out of sight, out of mind.
It does, yeah.
He's not going to change. He's still going to be that person. It's kind of better to have him there and say, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is false, this isn't credible, and have that on every person's profile that he gets retweeted on, because it kind of validates him. By banning him, just saying, actually, we don't like what you're saying, it's dangerous, we're just going to take you off. I don't see how it works.
I think the best way to do it and to do it without quote unquote censorship is if something isn't credible, just label it as it isn't credible or it's unsubstantiated, because then that puts the responsibility of the reader, me, to actually go through and check. So I've got to go through and check, oh, okay, this is a lie, or this is true, rather than we're just removing. That's what I would say. But I don't really. Can you hold a platform? I don't think you can't really hold a platform because Twitter doesn't need.
Well, the thing is, right? Like, I don't know how much money Twitter have, but I would bet on it being a lot. And in the same way that you get verified profiles, I think that surely with the advances in technology that we have now, we could reasonably expect over the next decade or so for measures to be put into place which verify news sources, like how you said, put a tick next to a news source if it's credible. If it's not credible, don't, and put the onus on the reader, because
I agree.
Otherwise it becomes a bit authoritarian and a bit nanny state-ish, which I don't really like the idea of.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think just to end it on that note, I think that's the only way you can do it properly is just put a label on this isn't credible, this isn't this and this, because that's the only way to properly substantiate it. But yeah, perfect.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me on.